all set in motion by a single mother's reluctant decision to accept an inheritance she never wanted, a crumbling pawn shop in a dying Pennsylvania town that would eventually bring curators from the Museum of the American Revolution to her cluttered storefront, trigger emergency authentication meetings at the Library of Congress, and ultimately reveal a treasure map drawn by Continental Army cartographers that had been sealed away for over 240 years. A map that pointed to Revolutionary War gold that historians believed was nothing more than colonial legend. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from, and if this discovery amazes you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I have something even more shocking to share with you. 29-year-old Jessica Martinez reviewed the quarterly earnings report that would secure her position as the youngest senior financial analyst in Meridian Capital Management's 85-year history. Her corner office on the 42nd floor of One Liberty Place, offering panoramic views of the Philadelphia skyline that had come to represent everything she had fought to achieve. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the Bloomberg terminal, analyzing market trends that would guide investment decisions for pension funds and institutional clients. Managing over $2.3 billion in assets, mahogany desk before her held 3 computer monitors displaying real-time market data from Tokyo, London, and New York, each screen representing a different piece of the global financial puzzle that Jessica had mastered with remarkable speed. The morning's analysis of emerging market volatility patterns would directly influence how Meridian allocated nearly $400 million in client investments. Decisions that carried weight far beyond the Philadelphia financial district where her reputation was rapidly becoming legendary. Just 18 months earlier, Jessica had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton with her MBA in finance, immediately recruited by Meridian's executive team after her graduate thesis on emerging market volatility had been published in the Journal of Financial Economics. The thesis, titled Predictive Modeling for Currency Fluctuations in Developing Markets, had challenged conventional wisdom about risk assessment and earned recognition from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia as one of the most innovative pieces of financial research produced by a graduate student in the past decade. Her starting salary of $145,000, plus performance bonuses that had already exceeded $40,000 in her first year, represented the culmination of a decade-long journey. From community college student to Wall Street rising star, but the numbers only told part of Jessica's remarkable story. A story that had begun in a cramped apartment in North Philadelphia, where she had learned to balance calculus homework with caring for her infant daughter while working 3 jobs to survive. The daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, Jessica had arrived in Philadelphia at age 12, speaking minimal English, her parents carrying little more than hope and determination as they sought better opportunities for their family. Her father, Miguel, had worked construction during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. To afford the studio apartment they shared with Jessica's younger brother, Carlos, her mother, Alina, had taken in sewing work from local dry cleaners. While battling the chronic kidney disease that would eventually consume their savings and test the family's resilience in ways they could never have anticipated. Jessica's path to academic excellence had required extraordinary sacrifice from every family member. While her classmates at Northeast High School worried about prom dates and college parties, Jessica spent afternoons tutoring younger students for $10 an hour while her mother watched baby Sophia, evenings working retail at Target, and weekends cleaning houses with Alina when her mother's health permitted. The $847 monthly income from these combined sources barely covered rent or utilities and basic necessities, leaving nothing for the college preparatory courses or SAT tutoring that Jessica's guidance counselor insisted were essential for admission to competitive universities. But Jessica had possessed something more valuable than expensive test preparation, an analytical mind that could recognize patterns others missed, and the determination to outwork anyone who stood between her and her goals. She had taught herself advanced mathematics using library books, spending countless hours in the Temple University Library, where she could access academic databases and study in silence, while Sophia napped in a stroller beside her Carol. The community college years had been simultaneously the most challenging and formative period of Jessica's life. Taking night classes while working full-time at a downtown insurance company, she had completed her associate degree in business administration with a 4.0 GPA, while Sophia learned to walk and talk in the cramped daycare center where Jessica volunteered on weekends in exchange for reduced childcare costs. Her professors at Community College of Philadelphia had recognized Jessica's exceptional abilities early, with Dr. Robert Kim, her microeconomics instructor, becoming the first person to suggest that Jessica's analytical skills warranted pursuing a 4-year degree at a major university. You have an intuitive understanding of market dynamics that I've seen in maybe 3 students during my 20-year career. He had told her during a conference that changed Jessica's perception of what might be possible for her future. The transition to Penn State had required Jessica to take out student loans, totaling nearly $45,000. A debt that terrified her, but represented the only path toward the financial stability she desperately wanted to provide for Sophia. Living in university family housing with other student parents, Jessica had maintained her 3.9 GPA in economics while working as a research assistant for the business school and sending $300 monthly to help cover her mother's medical expenses. Her undergraduate thesis on microfinance patterns in immigrant communities had caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Washington, Wharton's director of graduate admissions, who had recruited Jessica personally after reading her research on how cultural factors influenced financial decision-making among first-generation Americans. The full scholarship to Wharton's MBA program had felt like winning the lottery, except Jessica understood that her acceptance was based on merit and potential rather than luck. The Wharton years had transformed Jessica from a promising student into a formidable financial analyst whose insights regularly impressed professors with decades of Wall Street experience. Her specialization in emerging markets reflected both academic interest and personal understanding of economic uncertainty. Having lived through the financial instability that defined much of her childhood and early adulthood, her graduate school classmates included the children of Fortune 500 executives, international students from wealthy families, former investment bankers pursuing advanced degrees to enhance already successful careers. Jessica's background as a single mother who had worked retail jobs while pursuing her education made her an anomaly in Wharton's traditionally privileged student body. But her analytical abilities and work ethic had earned respect from classmates and professors who initially questioned whether someone with her background belonged in their rarefied academic environment. The research that had launched Jessica's career at Meridian Capital focused on identifying early indicators of currency instability in emerging markets, using machine learning algorithms to analyze patterns that traditional economic models failed to detect. Her methodology had predicted 3 significant currency devaluations 6 months before they occurred, generating substantial profits for the hedge fund that had licensed her research through Wharton's Technology Transfer Office. Meridian Capital's senior partners had competed aggressively to recruit Jessica, ultimately offering a compensation package that exceeded standard entry-level positions by nearly 40% and included a guaranteed path to partnership consideration. Within 5 years of graduation, the firm's founding partner, David Rothschild, had personally flown to Philadelphia to meet with Jessica, explaining that Meridian was seeking exceptional talent to lead their expansion into international markets. "We're not just hiring an analyst," Rothschild had explained during their dinner at Vetri Cucina, one of Philadelphia's most exclusive restaurants. "We're investing in someone who we believe will help define how institutional investors approach emerging markets for the next 20 years. Her Philadelphia mainline apartment, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic city views, represented security that her family had never experienced. The 2-bedroom unit in the prestigious Rittenhouse, square area rented for $3,200 monthly, more than Jessica's family had ever spent on housing in any given year during her childhood, but easily affordable on her new salary while still allowing her to save aggressively for Sophia's future education. The BMW 3 Series in her assigned parking space, leased through Meridian's corporate program, had replaced the 2008 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles that had carried Jessica through her final years of graduate school. The designer suits that filled her walk-in closet, purchased from Nordstrom and Brooks Brothers rather than the discount stores where she had shopped for the previous decade, represented more than professional attire. They were armor that helped her navigate boardrooms where she was often the youngest person and one of the few women. Most importantly, the steadily growing investment portfolio that would fund. Sophia's college education had reached $85,000 in just 18 months, a sum that represented more financial security than Jessica had imagined possible when she was working multiple jobs while pursuing her undergraduate degree. The 529 Education Savings Plan, supplemented by aggressive contributions to index funds and emerging market investments where Jessica's expertise provided strategic advantage, was positioned to eliminate any financial barriers to Sophia's academic ambitions. Sophia, now 8 years old and thriving at Friends Select School, had inherited both her mother's analytical mind and an artistic creativity that Jessica encouraged through violin lessons, art classes, and summer programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The private school tuition of $28,000 annually had initially seemed impossible to justify, but Jessica's research had convinced her that educational investment during elementary years would provide advantages that could influence Sophia's entire academic trajectory. "Mommy, why do we have such a big apartment now?" Sophia had asked during their first week in the Rittenhouse Square apartment, her small voice echoing in the spacious living room that could have contained their entire previous residence. "'Cause we worked very hard to get here, Mia," Jessica had replied, kneeling to Sophia's eye level, "because I want you to understand that anything is possible if you're willing to work for it and make smart decisions." The evening homework sessions in their beautiful apartment had become Jessica's favorite part of each day. Watching Sophia master multiplication tables while sitting at the dining room table where Jessica completed her own continuing education, coursework in quantitative analysis and international finance. These quiet moments represented the stability Jessica had promised herself during those terrifying early years as a teenage mother, when Sophia's future had seemed uncertain and resources were scarce. The partnership track at Meridian Capital was no longer a distant goal, but a realistic expectation based on Jessica's exceptional performance and rapid promotion within the firm's hierarchy. Her direct supervisor, Patricia Chen, a Harvard MBA with 15 years of experience managing institutional portfolios, had already begun discussing long-term career planning and the possibility of Jessica leading her own investment team within 3 years. "You have something that can't be taught," Patricia had told Jessica during her most recent performance review. "The ability to see patterns that others miss and the confidence to act on insights that challenge conventional wisdom. That combination is what separates good analysts from exceptional ones." Jessica's growing recognition within Philadelphia's financial community had led to speaking invitations at investment conferences and requests for commentary from financial publications covering emerging market trends. The Philadelphia Business Journal had featured her in their 40 Under 40 profile series, describing her as a rising star whose innovative approach to market analysis is attracting attention from institutional investors across the Mid-Atlantic region. More significantly, Jessica had been invited to join the advisory board of Temple University's Fox School of Business, where she mentored first-generation college students pursuing careers in finance. Her personal story of overcoming financial hardship to achieve academic and professional success resonated with students who faced similar challenges, and her practical advice about navigating competitive graduate programs and securing internships at prestigious firms had already helped several students obtain positions at major financial institutions. The consulting work Jessica had begun accepting on weekends, analyzing investment opportunities for family offices and smaller institutional clients, generated additional income exceeding $30,000 annually while building the professional network that would support her eventual partnership ambitions. Her reputation for identifying undervalued emerging market investments had attracted clients from New York and Washington, establishing Jessica as a recognized expert in her specialized field. At 29, with exceptional performance reviews, growing recognition within Philadelphia's financial community, and a compensation package that would exceed $200,000 when bonuses were included, Jessica Martinez was positioned to become one of the youngest female partners in Meridian Capital's history. The 5-year partnership timeline that had seemed ambitious when she joined the firm was now considered conservative by colleagues, who had observed her rapid advancement and exceptional client results. But Jessica's carefully constructed life, A financial security and professional success was about to be destroyed by someone. She trusted completely someone whose secret addiction would consume everything. She had worked to build while leaving her with nothing but an inheritance she never wanted in a town she had never heard of. The financial devastation would strip away her apartment, her career, and her ability to provide Sophia with the stability she had promised, leaving Jessica with only one asset, a crumbling pawn shop in rural Pennsylvania that contained secrets, worth more than all the Wall Street success she was about to lose. The betrayal that would destroy Jessica's achievements was already in motion. Hidden behind the professional competence and personal charm of someone who had access to everything she had worked to build, the person she trusted with her future was secretly gambling away both their shared dreams and Jessica's individual accomplishments, creating debts and obligations that would soon make her previous financial struggles seem manageable by comparison. That trust, Jessica would soon discover, had been her greatest mistake. But it would also lead her to discoveries that would prove more valuable than any Wall Street partnership, transforming her understanding of both American history and her own family's mysterious connection to events that had shaped the nation's founding. The inheritance she would soon reluctantly accept would reveal that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find something infinitely more precious than financial security. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning, in March, when Jessica discovered that their joint checking account showed a balance of $127. Instead of the $8,400 that should have been there, according to her meticulous financial records. She stared at her phone's banking app in confusion, refreshing the screen 3 times before calling the bank's customer service line to report what she assumed must be a system error or fraudulent activity. "I'm showing several large withdrawals." Over the past week, the customer service representative explained after Jessica provided her account verification information, 2 ATM withdrawals of $500 each on Friday and Saturday, then a $3,200 cash advance on your joint credit card on Monday, and a $4,100 wire transfer to Atlantic City Gaming Services yesterday evening. Jessica felt her stomach drop as she processed this information. Marcus Thompson, her boyfriend of 2 years, and the man she had been planning to marry, was the only other person with access to their joint accounts. They had opened the shared checking account 6 months earlier as a step toward combining their finances before their planned engagement. And Jessica had trusted Marcus completely with access to funds she had earmarked for Sophia's summer camp and their upcoming vacation to Disney World. "There must be some mistake," Jessica told the representative, her voice shaking slightly as she began to comprehend the implications. "I didn't authorize any of these transactions, and I need to speak with someone about getting this money returned to my account immediately." But even as she spoke, Jessica was beginning to remember troubling details that she had previously dismissed or rationalized away. Marcus's unexplained absences during recent weekends, claiming he was attending work conferences or visiting his sick grandmother in Atlantic City. The defensive way he had responded when she asked about his sudden reluctance to discuss their shared financial goals. The new credit cards that had been arriving in their mailbox, which Marcus had claimed were for building credit and maximizing rewards points. Marcus Thompson was a pharmaceutical sales representative for Johnson & Johnson, earning a base salary of $85,000 plus substantial commissions that brought his annual income to approximately $130,000. They had met at a young professionals networking event in Center City, where Marcus's charm and apparent financial stability had impressed Jessica, as much as his genuine interest in her background and career ambitions. Unlike many of the men Jessica had dated, who seemed intimidated by her academic achievements or professional success, Marcus had encouraged her career advancement and frequently praised her analytical abilities. He had been supportive during her transition to Meridian Capital, celebrating her successes and providing emotional support during the challenging early months. When she was establishing herself with new colleagues and clients, their relationship had developed steadily over 2 years, with Marcus gradually integrating into Jessica's life and forming a genuine bond with Sophia, had come to view him as a father figure. Marcus attended Sophia's school events, helped with homework, and had recently begun discussing plans for their future as a family, including his desire to formally adopt Sophia after he and Jessica married. The joint checking account had been Marcus's idea, presented as a practical step toward combining their finances in preparation for marriage and shared household expenses. Jessica had initially been hesitant to merge finances before formal engagement, but Marcus had persuasively argued that their relationship was serious enough to warrant shared financial planning. "We're building a life together," he had explained during their discussion about the joint account. "This is just recognizing the reality that we're already making financial decisions as a team. Plus, it'll be easier to manage household expenses and plan for Sophia's needs when we're working from the same accounts." Jessica had contributed $6,000 to the account from her savings, while Marcus had added $2,400 from his own checking account. The plan was to use the joint account for shared expenses like groceries, utilities, and entertainment, while maintaining individual accounts for personal spending and long-term savings goals. But now, staring at the nearly empty account balance, on her phone screen, Jessica realized that Marcus had been systematically withdrawing money from their shared account while concealing the transactions from her. The wire transfer to Atlantic City Gaming Services was particularly alarming, as it suggested that Marcus had been gambling with money they had designated for family expenses and Sophia's needs. The pattern of Marcus's behavior over the past several weeks suddenly began making sense in ways that filled Jessica with dread. His increased irritability when discussing their upcoming vacation plans, explaining that he might need to adjust the timeline due to cash flow timing with his quarterly commission payments, the way he had changed the subject whenever Jessica mentioned reviewing their combined finances to plan for their engagement and potential wedding expenses. Most disturbing was Jessica's realization that Marcus had been receiving phone calls at unusual hours, sometimes as late as 11 p.m. or as early as 6 a.m., which he had claimed were East Coast clients or medical conference coordinators. The calls had become more frequent over the past month, and Marcus had begun taking them in private, stepping onto their apartment balcony or into the bathroom to avoid Jessica overhearing the conversations. During one particularly memorable evening 2 weeks earlier, Marcus had received 3 separate calls during their dinner at Zahav, one of Philadelphia's most prestigious restaurants, where they were celebrating Jessica's latest professional recognition. Each time, Marcus had apologized and stepped away from the table, turning with increasingly strained expressions that he had attributed to difficult client situations that required immediate attention. "Is everything okay with work?"
Jessica
had asked after the third interruption, genuinely concerned about what seemed like an unusual level of urgency for pharmaceutical sales issues. "Just some complicated territory management stuff," Marcus had replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "It's nothing I can't handle. But you know how demanding some of these doctors can be about their scheduling and inventory needs." Now, Jessica understood that those late-night and early morning calls had likely been from creditors or gambling associates, and the stress Marcus had been displaying wasn't related to work challenges, but to mounting financial pressures that he had been concealing from her while continuing to access their shared resources. The defensive behavior that Jessica had attributed to work stress or relationship adjustment was actually Marcus's response to maintaining increasingly complex deceptions about his whereabouts, his financial situation, and his use of money from their joint account. The man she had viewed as a supportive partner was actually someone who had been systematically exploiting her trust while engaging in behavior that threatened both their individual futures and Sophia's stability. When Marcus returned to their apartment that evening, Jessica was waiting with printed bank statements and a list of questions that she had spent the afternoon preparing. She had arranged for Sophia to spend the night with her friend Emma's family, wanting to have this conversation without her daughter overhearing what might become a difficult confrontation. The apartment felt different as Jessica waited for Marcus to arrive home from what he had claimed was a client dinner in King of Prussia. The space that had represented their shared future now felt like a stage where Jessica was about to discover how thoroughly someone she loved had been deceiving her about fundamental aspects of his life and character. Jessica had spent the afternoon researching gambling addiction and financial fraud, wanting to understand the psychological and legal implications of what she suspected Marcus had been doing with their money. The information she had found was deeply disturbing, suggesting that gambling addiction often involved escalating, a deception, and financial crimes that could affect not only the addicted individual, but also family members and romantic partners who shared financial resources. "Marcus, we need to talk about our banking account," Jessica began when he finally arrived at 8:30 p.m., her voice carefully controlled despite the anxiety that had been building throughout the day. "I discovered some transactions that I don't understand, and I need you to explain what's been happening with our money." Marcus's initial response was a mixture of surprise and defensiveness that immediately raised additional red flags for Jessica, whose experience analyzing financial irregularities had taught her to recognize deceptive patterns in people's behavior. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, loosening his tie and moving toward the kitchen as if the conversation was merely a minor inconvenience, rather than a serious discussion about financial betrayal. "I've been using the account for exactly what we agreed: shared expenses and family needs." The casual dismissiveness of Marcus's response was particularly jarring because it contrasted so sharply with the gravity of the situation and the specific evidence Jessica was prepared to present. Someone who was genuinely innocent of wrongdoing would have been concerned about unauthorized transactions and eager to help resolve what appeared to be a serious banking error. "Marcus, there's a $4,100 wire transfer to Atlantic City Gaming Services that was sent yesterday," Jessica replied, following him into the kitchen and placing the bank statements on the granite countertop between them. "That's not a family expense, and it's not something we ever discussed or agreed to." The change in Marcus's demeanor was immediate and telling. His casual dismissiveness transformed into nervous energy as he avoided eye contact and began rearranging items on the counter that didn't need to be moved. The confident pharmaceutical sales professional who could charm doctors and negotiate complex contracts was replaced by someone who was clearly struggling to maintain composure under questioning. That was a business expense," Marcus said, his explanation lacking the confidence and detail that Jessica would have expected if he were telling the truth. "A client's entertainment situation that I had to handle quickly. I was going to reimburse the account as soon as my commission check clears next week." Jessica's analytical training had taught her to probe inconsistencies in explanations, and Marcus's response contained several elements that didn't align with what she knew about his work responsibilities and income timing. Pharmaceutical sales representatives didn't typically entertain clients at casinos, and Marcus's commission payments followed a predictable monthly schedule that Jessica had been tracking for 2 years. "Marcus, your commission checks are direct, deposited on the 15th of every month, which was last week," Jessica pointed out, her voice remaining calm despite her growing alarm. "And pharmaceutical sales doesn't typically involve client entertainment at casinos. I need you to be honest with me about what this money was actually used for." The conversation that followed revealed layers of deception that had been hidden beneath Marcus's charm and apparent financial responsibility. Over the course of 2 hours, Jessica discovered that Marcus had been gambling regularly at Atlantic City casinos for the past 8 months, initially using his own money but gradually escalating to larger bets funded by credit card advances and money from their joint account. "It started as just occasional entertainment," Marcus explained, his composure finally cracking as he realized that continued deception was impossible. "A few colleagues from work would drive down on weekends and I'd go along for the social aspect. But then I started having some really good nights, winning significant amounts. I began to see it as a legitimate way to supplement our income." Jessica listened with growing horror as Marcus described a progression from casual gambling to compulsive behavior that had consumed increasing amounts of time and money while being carefully concealed from her and everyone else in his life. The colleagues from work story was apparently fabricated. Marcus had been driving to Atlantic City alone, sometimes multiple times per week, and had been lying about his whereabouts during those absences. "I had a system," Marcus continued, his explanation echoing patterns that Jessica recognized from case studies of gambling addiction that she had encountered during her academic research on risk assessment. "I was tracking the patterns, keeping detailed records of wins and losses. I was actually ahead for several months, making money that I was planning to surprise you with for our engagement ring and wedding planning." The detailed records Marcus mentioned turned out to be a notebook hidden in his car. It's filled with dates, bet amounts, and outcomes that showed a clear progression from small wagers to increasingly desperate attempts to recover mounting losses. Jessica would later discover that Marcus's system is based on the common gambler's fallacy that past results could predict future outcomes, leading him to make increasingly larger bets when he was losing money. But Marcus's system had failed catastrophically during the past 6 weeks, resulting in losses that had consumed not only his own savings, but also the money from their joint account and cash advances on multiple credit cards that Jessica was only now learning existed. The good nights he had described were real, but had been followed by devastating losses that more than erased any temporary gains. "How much money are we talking about total?" Jessica asked, her financial training compelling her to understand the full scope of the situation before making any decisions about how to respond. Marcus's answer was devastating over the past 8 months. He had gambling losses totaling nearly $45,000. The money had come from his personal savings, $12,000. Cash advances on 4 different credit cards, $28,000. And the money from their joint account, $6,000. The credit card debt was accumulating interest at rates exceeding 20% annually. And Marcus had begun receiving calls from creditors demanding payment schedules that exceeded his monthly income. The magnitude of the financial damage was staggering. But Jessica was equally disturbed by the sophistication of the deception that Marcus had maintained while destroying their shared financial security. He had been intercepting credit card statements, hiding collection calls, and creating elaborate explanations for his absences and mood changes, all while continuing to participate in planning their future together. "I was going to tell you everything," Marcus insisted, tears visible in his eyes as he realized that his confession was destroying their relationship and future plans. "I just needed a few more good sessions to get back to even, and then I could pay everything back without you ever having to worry about it." The psychological pattern. Marcus was describing the belief that continued gambling could solve problems created by previous gambling. It was a classic symptom of addiction that Jessica recognized from her research. But understanding the psychological dynamics didn't diminish the practical reality that Marcus had stolen money designated for Sophia's needs while creating financial obligations that could threaten Jessica's career and their family's stability. "Marcus, you've stolen money that was designated for Sophia's summer camp and our family vacation," Jessica said, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. "But more than that, you've been lying to me for months while making financial decisions that could have affected our future together." The credit card debt that Marcus had accumulated represented a financial crisis that extended beyond the money he had already lost. With minimum monthly payments exceeding $1,800 and interest charges adding hundreds of dollars monthly to the total debt, Marcus was facing a financial hole that would require years to escape, even if he stopped gambling immediately. More troubling was Jessica's realization that Marcus's access to their joint account had given him the ability to potentially access other aspects of her financial life. She immediately began reviewing her individual accounts, credit reports, and investment statements to determine whether the betrayal extended beyond their shared resources. The conversation revealed that Marcus had been under increasing pressure from creditors who were threatening legal action to recover outstanding debts. Several of his credit cards had been suspended for non-payment, and he had received formal notices threatening wage garnishment and asset seizure if he didn't establish payment plans within 30 days. "How long did you think you could hide this?" Jessica asked, struggling to understand how Marcus had believed that his deception could continue indefinitely while his financial situation deteriorated. "I thought I could turn it around," Marcus replied, his explanation revealing the distorted thinking that characterizes gambling addiction. "I had been so close to breaking even several times. I just needed the right combination of bets to get back to where I started, and then I could pay everything back and start over." But Marcus's gambling had followed the predictable pattern of addiction, where losses led to increasingly desperate attempts to recover money through larger bets, creating a cycle that made financial recovery increasingly impossible. The right combination of bets he was hoping for would have required winning probabilities that were mathematically unrealistic given the house advantages built into casino games. "I need you to leave," Jessica told Marcus finally, after their Conversation had revealed the full extent of his deception and the impact on their shared financial situation. I need time to figure out how to handle this situation. I can't have you in our apartment while I'm trying to protect Sophia and myself from the consequences of your choices. Marcus's departure that night marked the end of Jessica's plans for marriage and the destruction of the financial stability she had carefully built for herself and Sophia, but it was only the beginning of discovering how thoroughly Marcus's addiction had compromised their shared future and Jessica's individual security. The apartment felt empty and violated after Marcus gathered his belongings and left, taking with him not only their shared future, but also Jessica's confidence in her ability to judge people and assess risks accurately. The man she had planned to marry and trusted with Sophia's welfare had been systematically stealing from their family while maintaining elaborate deceptions about his character and intentions. Over the following days, Jessica's investigation into the financial damage revealed additional problems that Marcus had concealed during their confrontation. Phone calls to his employer revealed that Marcus had been missing significant amounts of work due to his gambling activities, and his supervisor had been documenting performance issues that could lead to termination if not immediately corrected. The discovery that Marcus's job was in jeopardy added another layer of concern about his ability to repay the money he had stolen and cover the credit card debts he had accumulated. If he lost his position with Johnson & Johnson, his income would disappear while his financial obligations continued to accumulate interest and penalties. More immediately, the loss of money from their joint account meant that Jessica could no longer afford Sophia's summer camp or their planned Disney World vacation. She would need to withdraw money from Sophia's college savings account to cover basic living expenses, while addressing the fraudulent debts that Marcus might have created using her identity. The emotional impact of Marcus's betrayal extended beyond financial concerns to fundamental questions about Jessica's judgment and her ability to protect Sophia from people who might exploit their family's resources or stability. She had believed herself capable of accurately assessing character and identifying potential risks. But Marcus had successfully deceived her for months, while engaging in behavior that threatened everything she had worked to achieve. The realization that someone she had trusted with her most important relationship and Sophia's future security had been living a double life was almost as devastating as the financial damage he had caused. Jessica had to confront the possibility that her success in analyzing market risks and financial trends hadn't translated into wisdom about personal relationships and human character. But the crisis that seemed like the end of Jessica's carefully planned life would ultimately lead her to discoveries that were worth more than any Wall Street career or financial security she could have achieved through conventional means. Inheritance she would soon reluctantly accept from a great-uncle she had never known would reveal family connections to American history that had been hidden for generations. Marcus's gambling addiction had stolen Jessica's savings and destroyed her plans for conventional success. But it had also freed her from obligations and expectations that would have prevented her from pursuing the extraordinary opportunities that awaited her in a small Pennsylvania town she had never heard of, a building that contained secrets more valuable than all the money Marcus had stolen and all the career advancement she was about to lose. The phone call that would complete the destruction of Jessica's carefully built life came at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning. Just 2 days after Marcus had moved out of their apartment, Jessica was preparing Sophia's breakfast when her phone displayed the name Patricia Chen, her supervisor at Meridian Capital, was calling at an hour that immediately signaled serious professional trouble. "Jessica, I need you to come in immediately." Patricia's voice carried a tension that Jessica had never heard before in their 2 years of working together. "There's been a situation involving your personal finances that requires immediate discussion with human resources and our compliance department." Jessica felt her blood freeze as she processed the implications of Patricia's words. Financial services firms maintain strict policies about employees' personal financial situations, particularly any circumstances that might create conflicts of interest or suggest vulnerability to external pressure. The gambling debts and fraudulent activities that Marcus had concealed could easily trigger compliance investigations that might end her career regardless of her role as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "What kind of situation?" Jessica asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. I can't discuss details over the phone, Patricia replied, her tone professional but sympathetic. But there have been inquiries about your creditworthiness and some irregular activity on accounts associated with your Social Security number. You need to be here within the hour. The drive to Meridian Capital's offices felt like traveling toward an execution, with Jessica's mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end with her termination and the destruction of everything she had worked to achieve. She arranged for Sophia to stay with her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, explaining only that she had an urgent work meeting that might last several hours. The meeting that awaited Jessica at Meridian Capital involved not only Patricia Chen, but also David Rothschild, the firm's founding partner, along with representatives from Human Resources and the Compliance Department. The conference room felt like a tribunal as Jessica took her seat across from people who would determine whether her career survived Marcus's betrayal. Jessica, we've received notification from our background monitoring service about significant changes to your credit profile, David Rothschild began, his tone maintaining the respect he had always shown her, while clearly indicating the seriousness of the situation. There are multiple new credit accounts, substantial debt increases, and what appears to be fraudulent activity that occurred over the past several months. The monitoring service that Meridian Capital used to track employees' financial situations had detected the credit cards that Marcus had opened using Jessica's information, along with the forged personal loan that she had discovered among his hidden papers. Even though Jessica had been unaware of these activities, they appeared on her credit report as legitimate debts for which she was legally responsible. More concerning, Patricia added, consulting documents that Jessica recognized as copies of her credit reports, there are indications of possible identity theft or financial fraud that could affect your security clearance and your ability to access client accounts. The compliance representative, a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret Foster, explained that Meridian Capital was required by federal regulations to investigate any employee whose financial situation suggested potential vulnerability to bribery, extortion, or other forms of external pressure. The substantial debts that appeared under Jessica's name, combined with evidence of fraudulent activity, triggered automatic review procedures that could result in suspension of her access to client funds pending investigation. We understand that you may be a victim of identity theft or fraud, Margaret Foster continued, her tone suggesting that understanding didn't necessarily translate into lenient treatment. But until we can determine the full scope of the situation and your level of knowledge or involvement, we need to temporarily restrict your access to sensitive client information and trading systems. The suspension meant that Jessica would be unable to perform the core functions of her job while the investigation proceeded. Although she would continue to receive her base salary during the review period, she would lose access to the performance bonuses that represented nearly 40% of her annual income. More importantly, the suspension would be visible to colleagues and clients, effectively destroying her professional reputation regardless of the investigation's eventual outcome. How long does this type of investigation typically take? Jessica asked, though she suspected the answer would be devastating to her already precarious financial situation. Anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, David Rothschild replied, his expression indicating genuine regret about the situation. The timeline depends on the complexity of the financial irregularities and how quickly we can obtain documentation to support your claims of being a victim rather than a participant. 6 months without bonuses would eliminate Jessica's ability to maintain her current apartment, continue Sophia's private school tuition, or address the fraudulent debts that Marcus had created using her identity. The suspension effectively guaranteed that the financial damage from Marcus's gambling would expand beyond the money he had already stolen to encompass Jessica's entire career and lifestyle. We want to be clear that this is a precautionary measure, rather than an indication that we believe you've done anything wrong, Patricia Chen added. Though her words provided little comfort given the practical implications of the suspension, your work performance has been exceptional, and we hope the situation can be resolved quickly so you can return to full duties. But Jessica understood from her knowledge of compliance procedures that investigations of this type rarely concluded favorably for the employees involved, regardless of their actual culpability. The financial services industry maintained zero tolerance for any circumstances that might suggest compromised judgment or vulnerability to external pressure. The burden of proving innocence often exceeded employees' ability to provide satisfactory documentation. The meeting concluded with Jessica being escorted to her office to collect personal belongings while security personnel monitored her access to computer systems and client files. The humiliation of being treated as a potential security risk by colleagues who had previously respected her expertise was almost as devastating as the financial implications of the suspension. Returning to her apartment that afternoon, Jessica began the process of documenting Marcus's fraud while calculating how long her savings would sustain basic living expenses without her full income. The mathematics were brutal, even with her reduced salary during the suspension. She would be unable to afford her current rent, Sophia's school tuition, and minimum payments on the fraudulent debts that had appeared under her name. The investigation into Marcus's activities revealed additional layers of deception that extended the financial damage beyond what Jessica had initially discovered. Phone records showed that Marcus had been in contact with multiple payday loan companies, using Jessica's employment information to obtain short-term loans with interest rates exceeding 400% annually. Although these loans were technically illegal in Pennsylvania, the companies operated from other states and pursued collection activities that threatened Jessica's employment and professional reputation. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had attempted to open a securities trading account using Jessica's information and employment credentials, apparently planning to engage in high-risk investments that could have resulted in unlimited financial liability. The application had been rejected due to inconsistencies in the documentation, but the attempt was documented in financial databases that employers and creditors could access during background investigations. This is systematic identity theft, designed to maximize your financial vulnerability, explained Rebecca Walsh, the attorney that Jessica had retained to address the fraudulent accounts and protect her legal interests. Marcus wasn't just gambling with your money, he was creating a financial profile that would make it impossible for you to recover from his losses. The legal costs of addressing Marcus's fraud added another layer of financial pressure that Jessica had not anticipated. Rebecca Walsh's retainer alone cost $5,000, additional charges accumulating as she worked to dispute fraudulent accounts and document Jessica's status as a victim rather than a willing participant in the financial crimes. Meanwhile, creditors were pursuing collection activities that threatened to escalate. Beyond phone calls and letters to wage garnishment and asset seizure, the forged personal loan for $15,000 carried a default provision that allowed the lender to demand immediate full payment if monthly installments were missed, and Jessica had already received legal notices threatening court action to recover the debt. The payday loans that Marcus had obtained using Jessica's information were particularly problematic because the companies employed aggressive collection tactics that included contacting employers and threatening criminal prosecution for alleged check fraud. Although these threats were often legally baseless, they created additional pressure on Jessica's professional situation and her ability to resolve the compliance investigation at Meridian Capital. Sophia's reaction to the sudden changes in their family situation was heartbreaking for Jessica to witness. The 8-year-old understood that Marcus was no longer going to live with us, but couldn't comprehend why their lifestyle was changing so dramatically or why. Jessica seemed constantly stressed about money and phone calls from strangers. "We poor now, Mommy?" Sophia asked one evening, after Jessica had spent 2 hours on the phone with creditors, trying to explain that she was a victim of identity theft rather than someone who had willingly accepted responsibility for gambling-related debts. "We're going through a difficult time," Jessica replied, trying to provide honest communication without creating anxiety about problems that Sophia was too young to understand or help solve. "But we're going to figure out how to handle everything, and we're going to be okay." But privately, Jessica was beginning to understand that being okay might require fundamental changes to their lifestyle and her career ambitions that would affect every aspect of their future. The apartment they loved might need to be abandoned for cheaper housing in a less desirable neighborhood. Sophia's private school education might need to be replaced with public school alternatives that offered fewer resources and opportunities. The financial security that Jessica had worked so hard to build was disappearing regardless of her innocence in creating the crisis. The emotional toll of simultaneously fighting financial fraud, professional suspension, and relationship betrayal was affecting Jessica's health and her ability to function effectively in addressing any of these challenges. She was sleeping poorly, losing weight despite having no appetite, developing the chronic anxiety that seemed to accompany every phone call or piece of mail that might contain additional bad news about her situation. Departure. Jessica received a phone call that initially seemed like additional bad news but would ultimately provide the catalyst for everything that followed. The call came from attorney Michael Rodriguez of Rodriguez and Associates in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a name that Jessica didn't recognize, but who claimed to be handling estate matters for her recently deceased great-uncle, Antonio Martinez. Ms. Martinez, I'm calling about the estate of your great-uncle, Antonio Martinez, who passed away last month, attorney Rodriguez explained. According to his will, you are the sole beneficiary of his estate, which includes a commercial property in Millfield, Pennsylvania. Jessica was confused because she had never heard of Antonio Martinez or Millfield, Pennsylvania. Her family's genealogy was relatively straightforward, with her grandparents having immigrated from El Salvador in the 1950s and maintaining limited contact with extended family members who had remained in Central America or scattered across the United States. I think there might be some mistake, Jessica told attorney Rodriguez. I don't have any family named Antonio Martinez, and I've never heard of Millfield, Pennsylvania. The documentation I have indicates that Antonio Martinez was your grandfather, Miguel's brother, attorney Rodriguez explained, consulting estate records that apparently contained more information about Jessica's family history than she possessed herself. Antonio emigrated to Pennsylvania in 1963 and operated a business in Millfield for over 50 years. He never married and had no children, but he maintained records of his extended family and specifically named you as his heir. The conversation that followed revealed that Antonio Martinez had owned and operated Martinez Pawn and Jewelry in Millfield, Pennsylvania, a small town located approximately 90 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The business had been profitable for decades, serving a rural community that relied on pawn services for both emergency loans and the purchase of used goods at PSE. Affordable prices. Property includes the commercial building where the pawn shop operated, plus a small apartment above the store, attorney Rodriguez continued. There are also business assets, including inventory, equipment, and cash reserves that total approximately $45,000, according to the most recent appraisal. For Jessica, facing financial ruin and professional suspension, the inheritance represented an unexpected lifeline that could provide housing and potentially income during the crisis that Marcus's gambling had created. Although she had no experience with pawnshop operations, the property and business assets could be sold to address the fraudulent debts, while providing temporary stability during her legal and professional battles. What would be required for me to take possession of the property? Jessica asked, her mind already calculating how the inheritance might address her immediate financial pressures. The estate is relatively simple, since there are no other heirs or contested claims, attorney Rodriguez replied. We could complete the property transfer within 2 weeks, if you're prepared to accept the inheritance and assume responsibility for any outstanding business obligations. The decision to accept the inheritance felt like grasping at the only available option for survival, even though it meant leaving Philadelphia and the life Jessica had built for herself and Sophia. The alternative was watching her career disappear, while drowning in debts created by someone else's addiction, ultimately losing everything she had worked to achieve, while providing no better future for her daughter. That evening, Jessica sat in her living room, surrounded by legal documents, financial statements, and collection notices, while trying to determine whether accepting an inheritance from a relative. The mathematics of her situation were clear. Without her full income from Meridian Capital, she couldn't afford to fight Marcus's fraud while maintaining their current lifestyle. The phone call to her sister Carmen in Los Angeles revealed the depth of Jessica's desperation and the limited options available for addressing the crisis that Marcus had created. Carmen, I need to tell you about something that's happened that could change everything for me and Sophia. Jessica began, explaining both Marcus's betrayal and the unexpected inheritance from their previously unknown great-uncle. Wait, you're telling me that some uncle we've never heard of left you a pawn shop in rural Pennsylvania? Carmen asked, her legal training immediately focusing on the practical implications of accepting an inheritance from an unknown family member. Have you verified that this inheritance is legitimate? Sounds like it could be some kind of scam. Targeting people in financial distress, Carmen's skepticism was reasonable, given the timing of the inheritance notification. But Attorney Rodriguez had provided documentation that appeared authentic and had encouraged Jessica to conduct independent verification of Antonio Martinez's death and the legitimacy of his estate. The county records confirmed that Antonio Martinez had indeed died the previous month, and that probate proceedings were being handled through the Lancaster County Orphans Court. Even if the inheritance is legitimate, Carmen continued, you're talking about leaving Philadelphia, ending your career at Meridian Capital, and moving to a town you've never heard of to operate a business you know nothing about. That seems like a decision you might regret once you've had time to think through other options. But Jessica had been researching other options for 2 weeks without identifying any realistic alternatives to financial and professional destruction. Fighting Marcus's fraud would require legal expenses that exceeded her available resources. While providing no guarantee of successful resolution, compliance investigation at Meridian Capital would likely conclude with her termination regardless of her innocence, eliminating her primary source of income while damaging her professional reputation within Philadelphia's financial community. Carmen, I'm facing financial ruin and career destruction because of someone else's gambling addiction, Jessica explained, her voice reflecting the exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks fighting problems she hadn't created. This inheritance might be the only thing that allows me to provide stability for Sophia while I figure out how to rebuild our lives. The conversation with Carmen helped clarify Jessica's thinking about the inheritance, but it also highlighted how thoroughly Marcus's betrayal had eliminated conventional options for addressing her crisis. Accepting the pawn shop inheritance represented a desperate gamble, but it was the only gamble that offered potential for independence rather than prolonged financial and professional destruction. The decision crystallized when Jessica received notification that the compliance investigation at Meridian Capital had been extended indefinitely due to the complexity of untangling Marcus's fraudulent activities from Jessica's legitimate financial profile. The extension meant that her professional suspension would continue for at least 6 months, making it impossible to maintain her current lifestyle while fighting the legal battles necessary to clear her name. I'm going to accept the inheritance, Jessica told Attorney Rodriguez during their follow-up conversation. Whatever risks are involved in operating a pawn shop in rural Pennsylvania seem preferable to losing everything I've worked for a while, fighting debts I didn't create. The paperwork for accepting Antonio Martinez's estate required Jessica to travel to Lancaster for meetings with Attorney Rodriguez and officials from the Lancaster County Orphans Court. The trip provided Jessica's first opportunity to see Millfield, Pennsylvania, and evaluate the property she was inheriting sight unseen. Millfield turned out to be a small rural community with a population of approximately 3,200 people. Located in the rolling hills of Lancaster County among farms and small manufacturing businesses that served the agricultural economy. The downtown area consisted of 2 blocks of brick buildings dating from the early 1900s, with Martinez Pawn and Jewelry occupying a corner location that appeared to have good visibility and foot traffic. The pawn shop building was older than Jessica had expected, but appeared structurally sound, with large windows providing display space for merchandise and good natural lighting for the retail area. The apartment above the shop was small but clean, offering basic living accommodations that would eliminate rent payments while providing security for the business inventory below. Standing in the pawn shop surrounded by jewelry, musical instruments, tools, and electronics that represented other people's financial desperation, Jessica felt a connection to the customers who had been forced to sell family possessions to address temporary cash flow problems. The business that her great-uncle had operated for 5 decades was fundamentally about helping people survive financial crises, providing emergency loans and fair prices for goods that might otherwise have no ready market. "Your great-uncle was respected in this community," explained Dorothy Chen, elderly woman who had served as Antonio's bookkeeper for the past 15 years. "He was fair with customers and honest in his dealings. People trusted him because he understood that sometimes good people face circumstances that require difficult choices." The financial records that Dorothy Chen had maintained showed that Martinez Pawn and Jewelry had been consistently profitable, generating annual revenues between $180,000 and $1 to $20,000 while maintaining operating costs that allowed for reasonable owner compensation and reinvestment in inventory. The customer base included both regular clients, who used pawn services for emergency loans, and occasional sellers who brought items inherited from family members or acquired through estate sales. "The business model is straightforward," Dorothy Chen explained as she walked Jessica through the operational procedures that Antonio had developed over decades of serving the rural community. People bring items they want to sell or use as collateral for loans. You evaluate the items, offer fair prices, and maintain inventory that other customers want to purchase. The transition from Wall Street financial analyst to small-town pawnshop owner represented a dramatic change in career and lifestyle. But Jessica was beginning to understand that the inheritance offered more than just financial survival. The business provided immediate income and housing, while giving her time to resolve the legal and professional challenges that Marcus's fraud had created. Most importantly, accepting the inheritance would allow Jessica to provide stability for Sophia. During the difficult period of rebuilding their lives, the small apartment above the pawn shop would eliminate housing costs while the business income would cover basic living expenses and legal costs associated with fighting Marcus's fraud. As Jessica signed the paperwork that would make her the owner of Martinez Pawn and Jewelry, she felt a mixture of terror and relief that she was finally taking action to address the crisis that had destroyed her previous life. The decision represented both an ending and a beginning, the end of her Wall Street career and Philadelphia lifestyle, potentially the beginning of independence and security that couldn't be destroyed by someone else's addiction or deception. The building that she was inheriting sight unseen would soon reveal secrets that had been hidden for centuries, transforming her desperate escape from financial ruin into discoveries that would change her understanding of both American history and her family's mysterious past. The great-uncle she had never known had apparently preserved more than just a successful business. He had been the guardian of Revolutionary War-era documents that would prove more valuable than any Wall Street career Jessica could have achieved. But first, Jessica would need to learn how to operate a pawn shop while rebuilding her life from the wreckage that Marcus's gambling addiction had created. The inheritance that seemed like a desperate last resort was about to become the foundation for discoveries that would exceed every expectation she could have imagined when she made the decision to leave Philadelphia and everything she had worked to achieve. The devastating revelation was complete. Jessica had lost her career, her financial security, and her plans for the future. But she had also gained an inheritance that would soon prove to contain opportunities that no amount of Wall Street's success could have provided. The reality of Jessica's complete life collapse crystallized on a gray Monday morning in April as she stood in the empty living room of her Rittenhouse Square apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing everything she and Sophia owned that wasn't being repossessed by creditors or seized to satisfy Marcus's fraudulent debts. The movers would arrive in 2 hours to transport their belongings to a storage unit that Jessica could afford for exactly 3 months, after which even that modest expense would exceed her available resources. The apartment that had represented security and success just 6 weeks earlier now felt like a monument to naivety and misplaced trust. The panoramic city views that had inspired Jessica during her rise at Meridian Capital were obscured by the haze of an unusually cold spring morning, as if Philadelphia itself was turning away from someone who had lost the right to participate in its financial district's promise of prosperity and advancement. Sophia sat quietly on the hardwood floor where their dining room table had been until the previous day, when the leasing company had reclaimed furniture that Jessica could no longer afford under her modified payment schedule. The 8-year-old was reading a library book about horses one of the few activities that didn't require resources Jessica could no longer provide. While occasionally glancing toward the empty spaces where their television and her toy organizer had been positioned just weeks earlier. "Mommy, will I have my own room in the new place?" Sophia asked without looking up from her book, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that children develop when they sense that innocent questions might cause adult distress. Jessica knelt beside her daughter, struggling to provide honest communication without revealing the depth of their financial crisis or the uncertainty about whether the inheritance in Millfield would actually provide the stability she had promised Sophia during their most difficult conversations about the changes in their lives. "The apartment above the pawn shop has 2 bedrooms, Jessica replied, referring to the property she would inherit from Antonio Martinez but had not yet seen in person. "It's smaller than what we're used to, but it'll be our own space where we can start over and build something new together." The truth was more complicated and frightening than Jessica could explain to an 8-year-old. The inheritance represented her only remaining option for housing and income. But accepting it required moving to a rural community where Jessica had no professional connections, no support network, and no experience with the type of business that would determine their economic survival. More troubling was the possibility that the pawn shop inheritance might not provide sufficient income to support even basic living expenses while Jessica addressed the legal and financial challenges that Marcus's fraud had created. The business records that attorney Rodriguez had provided showed consistent profitability, but those records reflected Antonio Martinez's 5 decades of experience and established customer relationships that might not transfer to his inexperienced heir. The final weeks in Philadelphia had been a relentless series of humiliating encounters with creditors, collection agencies, and legal representatives who treated Jessica as someone who had willingly participated in creating the debts they were pursuing. Despite Rebecca Walsh's efforts to document Jessica's status as an identity theft victim, the legal system moved slowly while financial obligations continued accumulating interest and penalties that increased her total debt regardless of her actual culpability. The payday loan companies that Marcus had contacted using Jessica's employment information had proven particularly aggressive in their collection efforts, employing tactics that bordered on harassment while threatening legal action that could further damage Jessica's professional reputation. Although these companies operated in legal gray areas that made their threats difficult to enforce, they created additional stress and uncertainty during a period when Jessica was already struggling to maintain stability for Sophia, your mother, is going through some temporary financial difficulties. Jessica had been forced to explain to the administrators at Friends Select School when she could no longer afford Sophia's tuition payments. "We're hoping to resolve these issues quickly, but in the meantime, we need to make alternative educational arrangements." The transition from private school to public school registration had required Jessica to admit that her carefully planned educational strategy for Sophia was another casualty of Marcus's financial crimes. The neighborhood elementary school that Sophia would attend in Millfield, it offered fewer resources and opportunities than Friends Select, but it was free and available immediately without the background checks and financial documentation that private schools required. Sophia's reaction to leaving her friends and teachers at Friends Select had been heartbreaking for Jessica to witness. The 8-year-old understood that money problems were responsible for the changes in their lives, but she couldn't comprehend why adults' mistakes were affecting her education and social relationships. "Will I still be able to take violin lessons?" Sophia had asked during one of their conversations about the move to Millfield, her question reflecting priorities that 8-year-olds shouldn't need to worry about, but that now required careful consideration given their financial constraints. "We'll figure out what activities are available in Millfield," Jessica had replied, knowing that rural Pennsylvania was unlikely to offer the cultural and educational opportunities that had been accessible in Philadelphia, but hoping that smaller communities might provide different advantages that could benefit Sophia's development. The compliance investigation at Meridian Capital had officially concluded with Jessica's termination. Despite Rebecca Walsh's documentation of her status as an identity theft victim rather than a willing participant in the financial irregularities, the firm's decision was based on regulatory requirements that prevented employees with compromised financial situations from accessing client accounts, regardless of their actual culpability in creating those situations. reflect any judgment about your integrity or professional competence. David Rothschild had explained during the termination meeting that ended Jessica's Wall Street career. But federal regulations require us to maintain strict standards about employee financial stability. And the complexity of your situation creates ongoing compliance concerns that we can't adequately address. The termination eliminated Jessica's primary source of income while providing no severance payment or continued health insurance coverage. Her final paycheck, reduced by taxes and mandatory deductions, totaled $3,247. Barely. Enough to cover the storage unit rental and transportation costs associated with moving to Millfield while leaving nothing for the security deposits and utility connections that establishing residence in a new community would require. The professional reputation that Jessica had spent a decade building was effectively destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, making it unlikely that she could obtain employment with other financial services firms even after resolving the legal challenges created by Marcus's fraud. The background checks that investment companies conducted would reveal the compliance investigation and termination, creating doubts about Jessica's reliability that would persist regardless of eventual legal vindication. The financial services industry has a long memory for this type of situation. Patricia Chen had warned Jessica during their final conversation. Even if you successfully prove that you were a victim rather than a participant, the fact that these issues occurred will follow you throughout your career. The destruction of Jessica's professional future was particularly devastating because her expertise in emerging market analysis represented specialized knowledge that was valuable, primarily within the financial services industry. The analytical skills that had made her successful at Meridian Capital didn't translate directly to other industries. And her academic credentials were impressive but not sufficient to secure employment outside finance without additional training or certification. More immediately, the gap in employment created by the compliance investigation and termination would be difficult to explain to future employers without revealing the circumstances that led to her departure from Meridian Capital. Even positions outside the financial services industry often required background checks that would identify the termination and raise questions about Jessica's reliability and judgment. The liquidation of Jessica's investment portfolio to address immediate expenses had eliminated the financial security she had spent years building for Sophia's future education and their long-term stability. The index funds and emerging market investments that had grown to over $85,000 were systematically sold to cover legal fees, living expenses, and minimum payments on the fraudulent debts that creditors continued pursuing despite documentation of Marcus's deception. I feel like I'm watching someone else's life fall apart. Jessica confided to Carmen during one of their weekly phone calls that had become Jessica's primary source of emotional support during the crisis. Everything I worked for is disappearing, and I can't figure out how to stop it or even slow it down. Carmen's legal expertise had been invaluable in addressing some aspects of Marcus's fraud. But even successful resolution of the identity theft issues wouldn't restore Jessica's career or the financial assets that had been consumed by legal costs and living expenses during the months of professional suspension and investigation. The important thing is that you and Sophia are going to survive this, Carmen reminded Jessica, though both sisters understood that survival and rebuilding represented fundamentally different challenges. You have skills and education that can't be taken away, even if it takes time to figure out how to apply them in a new situation. But Jessica's confidence in her analytical abilities and decision-making skills had been severely damaged by her failure to recognize Marcus's deception and the financial risks he was creating for their family. The expertise that had made her successful in evaluating market risks apparently hadn't translated to accurately assessing personal relationships or protecting herself from someone with access to her financial resources. The week before leaving Philadelphia, Jessica had visited the neighborhood where she had grown up, hoping to find perspective about the changes in her circumstances by reconnecting with the community where her family had started their American journey with limited resources, but strong determination to create better opportunities for future generations. The modest apartment building where Jessica had lived during high school was still occupied by immigrant families pursuing the same dreams of education and advancement that had motivated Jessica's parents to sacrifice for her academic success. Walking through streets where she had once delivered newspapers and tutored younger students for spending money, Jessica was struck by how completely her circumstances had reversed from the trajectory she had planned. Maybe this is just a detour, rather than a destination, Jessica told herself as she stood outside the library, where she had spent countless hours studying for the SATs and researching college applications during her teenage years. Maybe losing everything is the only way to discover what's actually important. The optimism was forced but necessary for maintaining the emotional strength required to make decisions that would affect both her future and Sophia's development. During the critical elementary school years, the move to Millfield represented either a strategic retreat that would allow rebuilding from a position of stability, or a desperate gamble that would consume their remaining resources while providing no realistic foundation for recovery. The logistics of relocating to rural Pennsylvania while operating a business Jessica had never seen required careful planning with limited resources and no margin for error. The pawn shop had been closed since Antonio Martinez's death 6 weeks earlier, meaning that Jessica would need to reopen operations immediately upon arrival to generate income for basic living expenses. Dorothy Chen, the bookkeeper who had managed the pawn shop's financial records, had agreed to provide 2 weeks of training to help Jessica understand the operational procedures that Antonio had developed over decades of serving the rural community. But Dorothy was 73 years old and eager to retire, leaving Jessica with a narrow window to master skills that typically required years of experience to develop. Running a pawn shop is part retail sales, part financial services, and part psychology. Dorothy had explained during their phone conversations about the transition: need to evaluate items quickly and accurately, understand market values for everything from jewelry to power tools, and develop relationships with customers who often come to you during their most difficult financial periods. The inventory that Jessica was inheriting included thousands of items, ranging from expensive jewelry and musical instruments to everyday household goods that previous customers had sold or used as collateral for emergency loans. Managing this inventory required knowledge of market values, storage procedures, and legal requirements that Jessica would need to learn while simultaneously serving customers and generating income. More challenging was the customer service aspect of pawnshop operations, which required sensitivity to the financial desperation that motivated people to sell family possessions or accept high-interest loans secured by personal property. Jessica's experience with high-net-worth clients at Meridian Capital hadn't prepared her for helping people who were struggling to cover basic living expenses or address emergency financial needs. Your great-uncle understood that people don't come to pawn shops when things are going well, Dorothy Chen had explained. They come when they're facing eviction or medical bills or car repairs they can't afford. Being respectful and fair during those situations was what made his business successful and gave him a good reputation in the community. The emotional preparation for this career transition was complicated by Jessica's awareness that she was moving from being someone who helped wealthy clients increase their investment returns to being someone who would profit from other people's financial distress. The ethical implications of pawnshop operations required careful consideration, particularly given Jessica's own recent experience with financial crisis and the desperation it created. The final days in Philadelphia were spent completing paperwork to formally accept Antonio Martinez's estate while arranging the logistics of relocating to Millfield with minimal resources and no support network beyond Dorothy Chen's temporary assistance. Jessica had sold her BMW to cover moving expenses and would be driving a 2012 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles that she had purchased from a dealership that specialized in financing for people with damaged credit. The apartment above the pawn shop in Millfield would be furnished with items from the shop's inventory. As Antonio had lived simply and left few personal possessions beyond the business assets and property that comprised his estate, Jessica and Sophia would essentially be starting over with nothing but clothes, books, and the few personal items that had survived the liquidation of their Philadelphia lifestyle. "Are you scared about our new life?" Sophia asked during their final evening in the empty apartment, her question reflecting concerns that 8-year-olds typically express directly. When adults are trying to project confidence, they don't actually I feel I'm nervous about some things, Jessica replied, deciding that honesty was more helpful than false. Reassurance during a transition that would require Sophia to adapt to dramatic changes in their living situation and community. But I'm also excited about the chance to try something completely different and see if we can build something good together. The conversation that followed helped Jessica understand that Sophia was actually more adaptable and resilient than Jessica had given her credit for during the crisis. Children often accept change more readily than adults, particularly when they understand that the changes are being made by people who love them and are working to create the best possible outcomes under difficult circumstances. Will the kids in the new school be nice to me? Sophia asked, her concern reflecting practical worries about social integration, rather than broader anxiety about their financial situation or the dramatic changes in their lifestyle. I think you'll find good friends wherever we go, Jessica assured her. Though privately she worried about how Sophia would adjust to the cultural differences between urban Philadelphia and rural Pennsylvania, particularly given the contrast between the private school environment she was leaving and the public school system she would be entering. The drive to Millfield on their final morning in Philadelphia felt like a journey into an unknown future that could lead either to recovery and independence or to failure that would exhaust their remaining resources while providing no foundation for further attempts at rebuilding. Jessica had loaded their possessions into a small U-Haul trailer attached to her used Honda Civic, creating a caravan that represented everything they owned and the entirety of their resources for starting over. As they crossed the city limits of Philadelphia, Sophia looked back through the rear window at the skyline that had represented home for her entire life, her expression thoughtful rather than sad as she processed the magnitude of the changes they were making together. Mommy, will we ever come back to visit? Sophia asked her question, reflecting the natural desire to maintain connections to familiar places and experiences, even when circumstances require dramatic changes. Someday we'll visit, Jessica replied, though she understood that returning to Philadelphia would require rebuilding financial stability and professional reputation that might take years to achieve, if they were achievable at all given the damage that Marcus's fraud had created. The hour-and-a-half drive to Millfield provided time for Jessica to process the magnitude of the changes she was making and the risks she was accepting by leaving behind everything familiar to operate a business she knew nothing about in a community where she had no connections or support network beyond Dorothy Chen's temporary assistance. But as the urban landscape of Philadelphia gave way to the rural farmland of Lancaster County, Jessica felt a growing sense of possibility that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time in months, she was making decisions based on hope rather than fear, taking action to create opportunities rather than simply responding to crises created by other people's choices. The small town of Millfield appeared around a curve in Route 30, its modest Main Street lined with brick buildings that looked unchanged since the 1950s, but well-maintained, and occupied by businesses that served the agricultural community surrounding the town. Martinez Pawn and Jewelry occupied a corner location with good visibility and foot traffic, suggesting that Antonio Martinez had chosen his location wisely when he established the business decades earlier. As Jessica parked in front of the building, that would determine her family's future. She felt the weight of a decision that would define not only their immediate survival, but potentially the rest of their lives. The inheritance that had seemed like a desperate last resort when she accepted it was about to become the foundation for either recovery and independence or a final failure that would leave them with no remaining options for financial stability. The building looked solid and welcoming, its large display windows and a painted sign that needed refreshing but conveyed established business operations. Jessica could see Dorothy Chen waiting inside, ready to begin the training that would determine whether Jessica could successfully transition from Wall Street financial analyst to small-town pawnshop owner. But Jessica had no way of knowing that the building she was about to enter contained secrets that had been hidden for over 2 centuries. Secrets that would transform her desperate escape from financial ruin into discoveries that would change her understanding of both American history and her own family's mysterious connection to the nation's founding. The rock bottom that had seemed like the end of everything was actually the beginning of opportunities that exceeded every expectation. Jessica could have imagined when she made the decision to leave Philadelphia and accept an inheritance from a great-uncle she had never known. The desperate gamble was about to become the foundation for discoveries more valuable than any Wall Street career could have provided. Jessica's first 3 months operating Martinez Pawn and Jewelry passed in a blur of 12-hour workdays. Crash courses in appraising everything from antique jewelry to power tools, and the gradual realization that her great-uncle, Antonio, had built something far more sophisticated than she had initially understood. The small apartment above the shop had become home for her and Sophia, while the business below provided just enough income to cover basic expenses, while Jessica learned skills that no amount of Wall Street training had prepared her for. Dorothy Chen's 2 weeks of intensive training had covered the fundamentals of pawnshop operations, but Jessica was discovering that successfully serving rural Pennsylvania's working class customers required intuition and people skills that could only be developed through experience. The analytical abilities that had made her successful at Meridian Capital proved surprisingly useful in evaluating items and assessing market values. The customer service required a different kind of expertise entirely. Your great-uncle had a gift for making people feel respected during their worst financial moments, Dorothy had explained during her final day of training. That's what made this business successful. People trusted him because he understood that sometimes good people face circumstances that require difficult choices. Sophia had adapted to life in Millfield better than Jessica had expected. Making friends at the local elementary school and developing a fascination with the historical artifacts that customers occasionally brought to the pawn shop, the 8 had become Jessica's unofficial assistant, helping organize inventory and learning to identify different types of jewelry and collectibles with the quick intelligence that she had inherited from her mother. "Mommy, why do people sell things that belong to their grandparents?" Sophia asked one afternoon, as she helped Jessica catalog a collection of antique photographs and documents that an elderly farmer had brought in to raise money for veterinary bills. "Sometimes people need money more than they need objects." Surprised by her own emotional response to helping families navigate financial crises that reminded her of her own recent experience with desperation and limited options. But the important thing is that we treat their belongings with respect and try to give them fair prices for things that might be precious to them. The business had been generating enough revenue to cover rent, utilities, and basic living expenses. But Jessica was also discovering that her great-uncle had accumulated substantial cash reserves that suggested decades of careful financial management. The safe in the back office contained nearly $30,000 in cash, along with detailed records of profitable transactions and regular customers who had relied on Antonio's services for emergency loans and purchases of used goods at affordable prices. More intriguingly, Jessica had found evidence that Antonio Martinez had been far more educated and sophisticated than his role as a small-town pawnshop owner might have suggested. Hidden among his business records were documents indicating that he had been a professor of American history at Franklin and Marshall College before retiring to operate the pawn shop. And his personal library contained hundreds of books about Revolutionary War history and early American genealogy. Why would a college professor choose to run a pawn shop? Jessica wondered aloud as she examined Antonio's academic credentials and publication record, which included articles about colonial Pennsylvania and the Revolutionary War's impact on rural communities. The answer would come sooner than Jessica expected, but first she would need to address a problem that had been bothering her since taking over the business. The basement storage area, where Antonio had kept overflow inventory, was showing signs of persistent moisture problems that threatened to damage valuable items and create health hazards in the building's aging structure. The basement had flooded during a heavy rainstorm in June, requiring Jessica to move hundreds of items to higher storage locations while she researched solutions for the water infiltration that seemed to be getting worse with each significant weather event. Local contractors had provided estimates exceeding $8,000 for waterproofing that would protect the basement storage area, money that Jessica couldn't afford without depleting the cash reserves that provided her only financial security. "You need to address this before winter," warned Tom Bradley, the same contractor who had worked on the bakery in Harrisburg and who specialized in historic building renovation throughout central Pennsylvania. "Water damage in old buildings like this can escalate quickly once it starts affecting the foundation and support structures. Tom's examination of the basement revealed that the moisture problems were concentrated near the building's northeast corner, where the original stone foundation showed signs of settlement and deterioration that allowed water infiltration during heavy rains. The repair would require excavating around the foundation and installing modern drainage systems that could manage water flow more effectively. The good news is that the building's structure is fundamentally sound, Tom explained as he examined the basement walls with professional equipment. But this corner section needs attention before the water damage spreads to areas that would be much more expensive to repair. Jessica scheduled the foundation work for late August, when the pawnshop's business was typically slower and she could afford to temporarily reduce basement storage capacity. The project required moving most of the basement inventory to the main floor, creating crowded conditions but ensuring that valuable items wouldn't be damaged during the renovation work. It was while moving inventory from the basement's northeast corner that Jessica made a discovery that would transform her understanding of both her inheritance and her family's connection to American history. Behind a stack of old furniture that had apparently been undisturbed for decades, Jessica found a wooden crate marked with faded Spanish text and sealed with wax that had hardened but remained intact. "Sophia, come help me with this," Jessica called as she examined the crate, which was approximately 2 feet long, 18 inches wide, and secured with metal clasps that showed the corrosion patterns of significant age. Together, they carefully moved the crate to the main floor where Jessica could examine it more thoroughly under proper lighting. The Spanish text painted on the wooden lid was partially illegible due to age and water staining, but Jessica could make out Martinez and what appeared to be a date from the 1770s. "Is this from our family?" Sophia asked, her excitement evident. As she traced the faded lettering with her finger, "It might be," Jessica replied, though she was uncertain about the connection between the Spanish colonial period and her Salvadoran immigrant family. "Let's see what's inside before we make any assumptions." The metal clasps opened smoothly despite their apparent age, suggesting that the crate had been carefully maintained and periodically accessed over the centuries. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them remarkably well, Jessica found documents and maps that immediately struck her as historically significant. The papers appeared to be military documents written in English and Spanish, with dates ranging from 1777 to 1781. The handwriting was elegant and formal, suggesting educated authors, and the content appeared to relate to military operations and strategic planning during what Jessica recognized as the Revolutionary War period. Most remarkably, one of the documents appeared to be a detailed map showing geographic features and locations throughout southeastern Pennsylvania, with notations indicating hiding places for Revolutionary supplies and Continental treasures that had been concealed during British occupation of Philadelphia. "Mommy, these look really old," Sophia observed with 8-year-old directness. "Are they from when America was fighting to be its own country?" "I think they might be," Jessica replied, her voice reflecting growing excitement as she began to comprehend the potential significance of what they had discovered. "But I need to have someone who knows about old documents take a look at these before we can be sure about what we've found." The following morning, Jessica contacted Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, professor of Revolutionary War history at Franklin and Marshall College, who had been mentioned in several of Antonio's academic papers. Dr. Hawthorne had specialized in studying the Revolutionary War's impact on Pennsylvania's rural communities and had published extensively about the network of supply caches and treasure hiding places that Continental forces had established to protect valuable resources from British seizure. "Ms. Martinez, I was colleagues with your great-uncle for many years," Dr. Hawthorne explained when Jessica called to request consultation about the discovered documents. Antonio was fascinated by local Revolutionary War history, and he had theories about Spanish colonial connections to the Continental Army that most historians dismissed as speculative. Dr. Hawthorne agreed to examine the documents immediately, recognizing from Jessica's description that they might represent exactly the type of evidence that Antonio had spent decades researching. Her arrival at the pawnshop 2 hours later marked the beginning of authentication procedures that would confirm Jessica's discovery as one of the most significant Revolutionary War finds in Pennsylvania's modern history. These documents appear to be authentic Continental Army correspondence. Dr. Hawthorne announced after her preliminary examination using specialized equipment she had brought from the college. The paper composition, ink, chemistry, and handwriting. Styles are all consistent with Revolutionary Warrior and military documentation. More importantly, the documents contain detailed information about a network of supply caches and treasure depositories that Spanish colonial agents had helped establish throughout southeastern Pennsylvania to support the Continental Armies. Operations against British forces. The map showed locations where gold, silver, and valuable supplies had been hidden during the British occupation of Philadelphia. With specific landmarks and measurements that could guide modern recovery efforts, your great-uncle believed that Spanish colonial agents had provided covert support to the Continental Army through networks that history books never documented. Dr. Hawthorne explained as she photographed each document with professional equipment. These papers appeared to prove that he was correct, and they provide specific information about treasure locations that could still be recoverable today. The authentication process that followed brought experts from the Museum of the American Revolution, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian Institution to Jessica's small-town pawn shop, creating the kind of institutional attention that the original story's opening had promised. Each examination confirmed that the documents were authentic revolutionary war materials that could fundamentally change understanding of Spanish involvement in the American independence movement. Ms. Martinez, these documents represent one of the most significant Revolutionary War discoveries in decades, explained Dr. James Peterson from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. They provide direct evidence of Spanish colonial support networks that historians have theorized about but never been able to document. The map's detailed notations included GPS equivalent measurements that could guide modern treasure recovery efforts to locations where Continental Army gold and silver had been hidden during the war's most desperate periods. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at several indicated locations had already identified underground anomalies, consistent with buried containers that had remained undisturbed for over 240 years. More remarkably, the documents revealed that Jessica's family connection to these Revolutionary War secrets was not coincidental. Antonio Martinez had apparently been the hereditary guardian of documents that Spanish colonial agents had entrusted to the Martinez family in the 1780s, with the responsibility passing from generation to generation until it reached Antonio in rural Pennsylvania. Your great-uncle spent 50 years researching the historical context for these documents, Dr. Hawthorne explained as she reviewed Antonio's academic papers alongside the newly discovered materials. He understood their significance but was waiting for authentication technology that could prove their historical value without damaging the original papers. The treasure recovery efforts that began in September yielded discoveries that exceeded every expectation about the value and historical significance of the Revolutionary War supply network. The first excavation, conducted at a location 12 miles southeast of Millfield, uncovered a buried cache containing over 200 pounds of silver, coins, gold ingots, and precious stones that Continental forces had hidden to prevent British seizure. The monetary value of the recovered treasure was staggering. Preliminary estimates suggested that the silver and gold alone were worth over $3 million at current precious metal prices, while the historical significance of the coins and artifacts made them potentially priceless to collectors and museums. But Jessica was discovering that the financial implications of her discovery were complicated by legal questions about ownership, historical preservation, and her responsibilities as the custodian of nationally significant artifacts. The treasure was hidden on private property, which generally means you have legal ownership under Pennsylvania law, explained attorney Patricia Walsh, whom Jessica had retained to navigate the complex legal issues surrounding her discovery. But items of exceptional historical significance often attract government interest and institutional pressure that can complicate private ownership rights. The media attention that followed the treasure discovery transformed Jessica from an obscure small-town business owner into a national figure whose story captured public imagination about the possibility of discovering Revolutionary War gold. In modern America, the pawn shop became a tourist destination, with visitors traveling from across the country to see the location where the documents had been found, and to meet the single mother whose inheritance had led to rewriting Revolutionary War history. Single mother inherits pawnshop, discovers Revolutionary War treasure map became a headline that appeared in newspapers throughout the United States and internationally, creating exactly the kind of inspiring transformation story that the original narrative structure had been designed to deliver. Jessica's journey from bankruptcy and professional ruin to historical discovery and financial security represented the classic American dream of redemption through courage and determination. But for Jessica, the most important transformation was not financial, but personal. The discovery had provided her with a sense of purpose and connection to history that exceeded anything she had experienced during her Wall Street career, working with historians and archaeologists to document and preserve Revolutionary War. Artifacts gave her life meaning that went beyond personal financial security to contributing knowledge that would benefit future generations. Sophia's role in the discovery and recovery efforts had sparked her interest in American history and archaeology, leading to opportunities for educational experiences that would never have been available in their previous Philadelphia lifestyle. The 8-year-old had become the youngest person ever to assist with official Revolutionary War artifact recovery, earning recognition from the National Park Service and educational institutions that were developing programs to engage young people with historical research. "Mommy, are we famous now?" Sophia asked one evening as they reviewed newspaper articles about their discovery and the ongoing treasure recovery efforts. "We're part of something important," Jessica replied, watching. Her daughter examined photographs of colonial era coins that had been hidden for over 2 centuries. "We helped discover information that changes what people know about how America became independent." The pawnshop business had evolved into something far more sophisticated than Jessica had initially imagined possible. The publicity surrounding the Revolutionary War discovery had attracted customers and collectors from throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, while Jessica's growing expertise in historical artifacts had established her as a recognized authority in appraising and authenticating antique items. More importantly, the financial security provided by the treasure discovery had allowed Jessica to establish scholarship programs for first-generation college students and support historical preservation projects throughout Lancaster County. The woman who had lost everything to someone else's gambling addiction had become someone whose discoveries benefited entire communities while preserving American history for future generations. The legal resolution of Marcus's fraud had been expedited by the media attention surrounding Jessica's discovery, with prosecutors eager to demonstrate that identity theft victims could achieve justice and recovery despite the challenges of financial crimes. Marcus had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison while being required to pay full restitution for the money he had stolen, though his actual financial situation made recovery unlikely. "I don't feel angry about Marcus anymore," Jessica confided to Carmen during one of their regular phone conversations about how dramatically their lives had changed. "What he did was terrible, but it led directly to discoveries that changed everything. For me and Sophia in ways that never could have happened if I had stayed at Meridian Capital. The transformation was complete, but it was also just the beginning." The Revolutionary War documents had contained references to additional treasure caches throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, suggesting that Jessica's initial discovery represented only a small portion of a continental network that Spanish colonial agents had established to support American independence. The research partnerships that Jessica had developed with major universities and museums were yielding new discoveries about Revolutionary War history that challenged conventional understanding of how the Continental Army had financed its operations and maintained supply lines during the war's most difficult periods. Jessica had become a central figure in historical research that was rewriting textbooks and changing scholarly understanding of America's founding period. What started as a desperate attempt to escape financial ruin has become a life dedicated to preserving and sharing American history, Jessica reflected as she stood in the pawn shop that had been transformed into a center for Revolutionary War research and artifact preservation. "I never could have imagined that losing everything would lead to finding something so much more valuable than anything I thought I wanted." The building that she had inherited for the price of accepting an unwanted responsibility had contained secrets worth more than any Wall Street career could have provided. The great uncle she had never known had preserved not just a successful business, but a family legacy that connected her to the founding of the nation and provided her with opportunities to contribute to historical knowledge that would benefit generations of Americans. Sophia's future had been transformed from the conventional educational path that Jessica had planned in Philadelphia to extraordinary opportunities for learning and growth that combined historical research, archaeological discovery, and public education. The child who had lost her private school education due to financial crisis had gained access to experiences and mentors that no amount of conventional success could have provided. "Will we keep finding treasure?" Sophia asked, as they reviewed maps and documents that suggested additional Revolutionary War sites throughout Pennsylvania. "We'll keep discovering important things," Jessica assured her, understanding that the treasure they had found was valuable, primarily because it helped preserve and share knowledge about American history. But the most important discovery is that sometimes losing everything you think you want is the only way to find what you're actually meant to do. The story that had begun with devastating betrayal and financial ruin had become a testament to the possibility of transformation through courage, determination, and the willingness to pursue opportunities that seemed impossible or impractical. Jessica's journey from Wall Street success to pawn shop ownership to Revolutionary War discovery proved that extraordinary outcomes often emerge from circumstances that initially appear to represent failure or desperation. The inheritance that had seemed like a desperate last resort had revealed itself as a connection to American history that provided meaning and purpose beyond anything Jessica could have achieved through conventional financial success. The building, purchased by a woman with no options, had contained opportunities that exceeded every reasonable expectation about what was possible for someone willing to start over from nothing. As Jessica locked the door of Martinez Pawn and Jewelry on another day of serving customers, consulting with historians, and planning archaeological excavations, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from bankruptcy in Philadelphia to Revolutionary War discovery in rural Pennsylvania. The life she was building with Sophia was different from anything she had previously imagined, but it was also more meaningful and fulfilling than the conventional success she had lost. The final lesson of Jessica's transformation was that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to someone, losing everything they've worked to achieve, becomes the catalyst for discovering opportunities that would never have been accessible through conventional paths. The betrayal that had destroyed her financial security had freed her to pursue discoveries that changed both her understanding of American history and her vision for what a meaningful life could accomplish. The single mother who had inherited a pawn shop to escape financial ruin had become the guardian of Revolutionary War secrets that changed scholarly understanding of how America achieved independence. The desperate gamble had become the foundation for contributions to historical knowledge that would benefit future generations while providing Jessica and Sophia with financial security and life purpose that exceeded anything their previous lifestyle had offered. The story was complete, but the discoveries were continuing. The network of Revolutionary War treasure sites that Jessica had uncovered represented ongoing opportunities for historical research and archaeological exploration that would keep her connected to American history while building a legacy that honored both her great-uncle's dedication and her family's connection to the nation's founding. From Wall Street analyst to pawn shop owner to Revolutionary War, historian Jessica Martinez had proven that transformation is possible for anyone willing to embrace uncertainty in pursuit of opportunities that transcend conventional definitions of success. Her journey demonstrated that sometimes losing everything becomes the foundation for finding something infinitely more valuable than anything that was lost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.